arrogance, fraud, and a stunning downfall. Watch how one man's wealth couldn't save him from justice. The chatter in the courtroom buzzed like a hive of restless bees, tension crackling in the air. People packed into the benches, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes flicking toward the defendant's table. Whispers passed from one mouth to the next, each rumor more scandalous than the last. Then he walked in. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal gray designer suit, the man carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His slicked-back hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and he smirked at the crowd as if the room had gathered to admire him, not judge him. Ethan Grayson, the name that had dominated headlines for weeks, looked more like a guest of honor than a defendant accused of stealing millions from struggling families. But it wasn't his entrance that turned heads. It was what happened when Judge Monica Lee entered the courtroom. Dressed in her black robe, Judge Lee moved with quiet authority as she approached the bench. She didn't need to raise her voice or glance at the crowd to command respect. Her presence was enough. Her reputation preceded her, a no-nonsense judge who valued justice above all else. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee," the bailiff announced. Everyone rose, everyone except Ethan Grayson. The room fell silent. All eyes shifted to the defendant, who remained seated, casually flipping through a legal pad as though the proceedings were a trivial inconvenience. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Ethan waved him off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Judge Lee paused at her bench, her gaze piercing. Her face betrayed nothing, but the silence grew heavier with every passing second. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Disbelief. Palpable. Who did this man think he was? But Ethan didn't flinch. His expression was smug, almost daring the judge to react. "You may be seated," Judge Lee said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't address the slight, not yet, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The tension wasn't just palpable now, it was suffocating. But this was only the beginning. Ethan Grayson was about to learn the hard way that even the wealthiest and most entitled are not above the law. Ethan Grayson wasn't just any wealthy man, he was the kind of rich that made headlines: luxury yachts, multi-million-dollar mansions on both coasts, private jets, and parties that could rival those of Hollywood's elite. His business empire, Grayson Investments, had once been touted as a beacon of financial success. But behind the glitz and glamour lay a darker truth. Grayson's rise to the top had been built on deception. Promising small business owners and middle-class families a chance to secure their futures, he had convinced hundreds to invest their life savings into fraudulent schemes. Retirement accounts, college funds, even entire family inheritances, gone in the blink of an eye. The fallout was devastating. Families lost their homes. Parents struggled to feed their children. Elderly couples faced the terrifying prospect of living out their final years in poverty. The ripple effects of his greed spread far and wide. But to Ethan, it was just business. When investigators finally caught up to him, the evidence was staggering. Bank records, falsified documents, and testimony from former employees painted a damning picture. Yet even with the walls closing in, Ethan remained confident. "I've got the best lawyers money can buy," he had told reporters outside his mansion in Malibu. "This will blow over." It always does. And for a while, it seemed he might be right. His legal team filed motion after motion, delaying the trial for months. They painted him as a misunderstood entrepreneur, a scapegoat for the failures of others. But no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the mountain of evidence or the heartbreak of his victims. By the time the trial finally began in San Francisco, the courtroom was packed daily with people seeking justice, or at least some semblance of it. Among them was Angela Martinez, a widowed mother of 3 who had lost her home after investing with Grayson. Her youngest daughter had been forced to drop out of college. Sitting beside her was Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter who had spent decades saving for retirement, only to end up living in his brother's spare room. Their stories, and countless others, were shared in gut-wrenching detail during the trial. Angela's voice broke as she described the day she realized she couldn't make the mortgage payment. "I begged them not to take the house," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they didn't care. My kids had to sleep in our car for 2 weeks. Do you know what that feels like?" Peter's testimony was just as harrowing. "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "And this man, he burned my future to the ground without a second thought." But through it all, Ethan sat there, unbothered. He often leaned back in his chair, scrolling on his phone or whispering jokes to his attorney. To him, these were just stories, irrelevant noise that wouldn't change the outcome he believed was already in his favor. The press ate it up. Headlines screamed about his arrogance, his lack of remorse, and the bold disrespect he had shown to the court. Public opinion was turning against him. But Ethan didn't care. As far as he was concerned, public opinion didn't write checks. His lawyer tried to spin the narrative. "Mr. Grayson deeply regrets any hardship caused," the attorney said during a press conference, "but he remains confident that the truth will prevail." The truth, however, was that Ethan had no intention of admitting guilt. He was betting on the system bending in his favor, just as it always had before. But this time there was one factor Ethan hadn't accounted for. Judge Monica Lee wasn't like the people he was used to dealing with. The trial was a spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, reporters jostling for position to capture every detail. Inside, the tension only grew as the days dragged on. Witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another nail to Ethan Grayson's metaphorical coffin. But it wasn't just the testimonies that drew gasps from the audience. It was Ethan's behavior. On the third day of the trial, the prosecution presented damning evidence. A series of emails in which Ethan explicitly instructed his team to falsify records and mislead investors. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read his words aloud. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line." The words hung in the air like poison. Angela Martinez, sitting in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Peter Vaughn clenched his fists. "And Ethan?" He smirked. The prosecutor turned toward him, her voice sharp. "Mr. Grayson, do you recognize this email?" His lawyer jumped in before he could answer. "Objection. This question has been asked and answered in pre-trial hearings." Judge Lee raised a hand, her expression calm but firm. "Overruled. The defendant will answer the question." Ethan leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, I recognize it. But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." The crowd erupted in whispers. Judge Lee's gavel struck like a thunderclap. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. She turned her attention back to Ethan. "Mr. Grayson, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting." But Ethan didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed amused, like this was all just an elaborate game. As the trial continued, his arrogance only grew. He interrupted witnesses with sarcastic chuckles, rolled his eyes during cross-examinations, and whispered loudly to his lawyer at key moments. The audience watched in disbelief as he treated the courtroom like his personal stage. Then came the day of Angela Martinez's testimony. She stepped up to the stand, clutching a folded piece of paper in trembling hands. Her voice was shaky as she began, but her words carried the weight of her pain. "I trusted him," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "I trusted him with everything I had, and he destroyed my family's future." Ethan didn't even look at her. He leaned back in his chair, casually scrolling through his phone. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interrupted, pointing toward Ethan. "The defendant is clearly not paying attention to the witness." All eyes turned to Judge Lee. Her face was impassive, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice measured, "put your phone away, now." Ethan glanced up, unfazed. "I was just checking something important," he said, holding up the device as if to prove his point. Judge Lee's tone hardened. "I said now." For a moment it seemed like he might argue, but then, reluctantly, he set the phone down. The tension in the room was palpable, but the damage was already done. Angela's testimony continued, but her voice carried a tremor of disbelief, as though she couldn't fathom such a blatant lack of basic human decency. By the end of her statement, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Ethan's. A week later, the prosecution rested its case, leaving the defense to make their move. Ethan's lawyer tried everything, discrediting witnesses, twisting the narrative, even painting Ethan as a victim of overzealous prosecutors. But the cracks were too big to cover. Through it all, Judge Lee maintained her composure. She rarely spoke, but her presence loomed over the room like a steady, unwavering force. Yet it was clear to everyone watching that her patience with Ethan's antics was wearing thin. The trial had reached its final day. The air in the courtroom was electric, the anticipation almost unbearable. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised and cameras ready. The gallery was packed with victims, their faces a mix of anger and hope. All eyes were on Judge Monica Lee as she prepared to deliver the sentence. Ethan Grayson sat at the defense table, his posture as relaxed as ever. He even had the audacity to flash a small grin to the cameras as they captured his every move. He didn't look like a man about to face judgment. He looked like a man convinced he had already won. When Judge Lee finally spoke, the room fell silent. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims paint a clear picture of your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed the lives of countless people, all for personal gain." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Judge Lee continued, "Throughout this trial, you have shown a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful. You have insulted your victims, disregarded this court's authority, and treated these proceedings as if they were beneath you." The crowd murmured in agreement. Angela Martinez, sitting in the front row, clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles white. Judge Lee's tone shifted, becoming colder. "Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not about wealth, power, or privilege. It is about accountability. And today, you will face the consequences of your actions." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustling of paper. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. He straightened in his chair. "Therefore," the judge declared, "I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Ethan's face froze, the blood draining from his cheeks. 25 years. He'd been expecting a slap on the wrist, maybe a few months in a cushy facility. But this? This was unheard of for someone of his stature. Judge Lee wasn't. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets to repay the victims of your crimes. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the families you devastated." The courtroom broke into stunned murmurs. Angela Martinez pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Peter Vaughn leaned back in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan shot up from his chair, his face red with anger. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I'm Ethan Grayson. You can't treat me like some common criminal." Judge Lee's gavel slammed down, her expression unyielding. "Mr. Grayson, sit down." But Ethan wasn't finished. "This is a joke. I'll appeal this. I'll have your career ruined, Judge." The bailiffs moved closer, ready to intervene. Judge Lee remained calm, her voice cutting through his outburst like a knife. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson, and you will show respect. Bailiffs, escort the defendant out." As he was led away, Ethan continued to protest, his voice growing fainter with each step. The courtroom erupted into applause, something that rarely happened but felt entirely appropriate in the moment. Judge Lee turned to the audience, her expression softening just slightly. "Justice has been served," she said. "Let this be a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." But as the courtroom emptied and the cameras outside began flashing, one question lingered in everyone's minds. Would this sentence be enough to truly change a man like Ethan Grayson? The courtroom was nearly empty now, save for a few lingering reporters and victims gathering their belongings. The buzz of excitement still hung in the air, but for those directly affected by Ethan Grayson's crimes, the emotions were more complex. Angela Martinez stood by the courthouse steps, clutching her purse tightly. A reporter approached her with a microphone. "How do you feel after today's verdict?" Angela hesitated, then said, "I feel relieved. But the truth is, no sentence will erase the damage he caused. My kids and I are still rebuilding, but at least now we have hope." Nearby, Peter Vaughn was speaking with a friend. "It's not just about the years he's getting," he said, shaking his head. "It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proves they're not." Inside her chambers, Judge Monica Lee sat quietly, staring out the window at the commotion below. She didn't feel triumph or victory, just a steady resolve. Her role wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring fairness, about reminding everyone that the scales of justice could balance, even against the weight of wealth and privilege. Ethan Grayson would continue to make headlines for a while, but for the people he had wronged, the chapter was finally closing. The financial restitution would help many of them start over, but the scars he left behind would take longer to heal. As the weeks passed, the story sparked conversations across the country. It became a rallying cry for accountability, for holding those in power to the same standards as everyone else. People shared their own stories of injustice, drawing strength from the verdict. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from Angela's youngest daughter, Sophia, who wrote a letter to Judge Lee that was later published in a local newspaper. "Thank you for standing up for my family," it read. "Thank you for showing us that people like Ethan Grayson can't get away with hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us a second chance." The story of Ethan Grayson's trial was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a reminder of the resilience of ordinary people, the importance of integrity, and the belief that justice can and should prevail, no matter the odds. So as you sit with this story, ask yourself, what does accountability mean to you? And in your own life, how can you ensure that fairness and justice are not just ideals but actions? Because in the end, justice isn't just the responsibility of the courts. It's something we all have to fight for every day.